So the software-defined data center, I guess the first question really is, what is it? I mean, as a term, it's really not much more than a year old. I think it could be some confusion about it. As I mentioned, I saw this headline this morning: spending on virtualization is falling as companies get on board with software-defined data centers. I'm a little confused. Don't you have to spend money on virtualization if you're spending money on software-defined data centers? So what is the SDDC? Stu, care to define that?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a first stab at it. So yeah, I'd agree with you that SDDC is a relatively new term. VMware is usually given credit for coming up with this category, and everybody is either trying to draft off of this trend or compare and contrast what they're doing with it. So of course, VMware is known as really virtualizing the compute layer, and what VMware position is the software-defined data center is going to do with the rest of the stack what they did with the compute side. So both storage and networking, which for the most part were actually made a little bit more difficult to manage when you had server virtualization, should be able to have the same kind of flexible and agile capability that we have on the compute side. Typically using some kind of virtualization, usually software-defined networking is what we're talking about on the networking side. And on storage, there's a number of solutions out there that are trying to do some kind of software-defined storage.
Peter, how do you, when people say, what is software-defined data center, how do you define that to folks?
Well, I think it's all about making the data center as programmable as the other infrastructure. There's the virtualization on the servers, but when you get to things like storage and networking, it's not an order of minutes to get it to do what you want. It's an order of days, weeks, months sometimes. So it's all about programmability, APIs, driving it, and it doesn't have to be an expense on the virtualization side, right? There's free hypervisors as well. So now the battle is moving from hypervising, I think that gets to be free, toward how do you drive it, what do you orchestrate it with, things like OpenStack get interesting at that point.
Right. Rich, your sense of when people say, what is this new buzzword called software-defined data center, I mean, how do you put that in a nutshell for people?
Yeah, I think, as we look at it, ultimately it's the alignment of an application down through infrastructure. So how can you take something that in current or legacy environments, an application sits on top of infrastructure? How do you make that application be part of infrastructure to align to various requirements? And as I think everyone kind of mentioned, think of it in three parts: the network side, the compute layer, and then ultimately getting to data, which is generated by the application. So it's the alignment of those three buckets.
Mark, I guess I would say, what is it? And that next step really is not only what is a software-defined data center, but what does this do for me operationally? Why should I be concerned about this?
Sure. No, I think we did a good job defining it. It's ultimately, Stu hit upon a good point, it's ultimately doing what we did at the server layer with the hypervisor and extending that to other pieces of infrastructure. So we used the example of storage and networking for a good example. You mentioned also the economic piece of it, James, as well. So if you look at what, for storage virtualization, for example, what it's really doing, a software-defined storage, is really taking a software layer, taking really direct attached or commodity-based storage, and delivering similar, or at least that functionality that's needed at that storage layer, to that, and you guys made great points, at that virtual machine or application layer. And it's the same thing that you mentioned, Peter, from the networking perspective, right? It's that programmability from that software perspective, leveraging not the data center architecture of the old, but leveraging that network services that you can plug in on top of that virtualized infrastructure.